Alrighty, I think we'll get started here. Thank you guys for coming out to the second event of the Journal on Legislation Symposium, Legislating on the World Stage. It's very exciting, and we appreciate it, especially at 5 o'clock. I know everyone's very busy, so thank you all for coming out. Real quickly, we want to thank all of our co-sponsors for this event. First of all, the Dean of Students Office, the American Constitution Society, the Asia Law Society, China Law Association, European Law Society, the Harvard International Arbitration Law Students Association, and the International Law Journal. And quick plug as well for our other two events that we're going to have later this week. Tomorrow at lunch, Congressman Adam Schiff, who's the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee, is going to be speaking in WCC 1010, and Indian food will be served. And then on Friday, Hans van der Weerd, who's Vice President of U.S. Programs at the International Rescue Committee, is going to be speaking at lunch. TBD on food, but it will be good. And very happy to introduce our speaker today, James Wharton. A little bit about James. He is from the northeast of England and got his political start in the northeast of England, was a lawyer working in that area, which is sort of like culturally sort of similar to the U.S. Rust Belt in a lot of ways, and was very labor left-leaning area, still is a very labor left-leaning area. And James is a young conservative politician, or aspiring politician, made a name for himself, got elected at 26, and was a rising star even before the Brexit Referendum Bill happened. But James, I'm sure this will come up a little bit, had the opportunity to introduce a Brexit Referendum Bill in the House of Commons that ended up not turning into the actual bill, but was resurrected in the next Parliament, and that became the Brexit Referendum Bill that we all know. But that really raised James' profile even more than it already was beforehand, and he was named the Minister for the Northern Powerhouse in the UK, so trying to bridge the gap between the southeast of England, where London has a lot of money and power, with the other parts of the country that were lacking in some of that money and power. And most recently, he's been named the Parliamentary Undersecretary of State for International Development, where he's in charge of UK aid to Africa. And so there's a lot to talk about here. In full disclosure, I interned for James 5 years ago, and I've found him to be a wonderful person to learn from, but also to engage with on issues and debate with, and he certainly has not shied away from any frank discussions about issues. So if you guys have questions, please feel free to ask, and I'll stop talking now so he can start. Thank you, guys.
Great, thank you. Am I going to ruin your filming if I come around the front? I'm not going to use notes. I don't like standing behind something. I think it sort of puts a barrier between me and the enthusiastic burrito-eating audience that I'm going to address. Look, thank you, Josh, for the introduction. Thank you for inviting me. When I was asked to come, I sort of thought, what should I talk about? And as has been said in the introduction, I am a lawyer, but I'm also a politician. And actually, what I want to talk about, therefore, is to touch on the political context of some of that which we do in terms of legislating and making law, and to talk a little bit about how politics influences law, but particularly in the context of the EU referendum that's taken place in the UK last year. So I think sort of by way of a bit of scene setting, and to explain what is meant by the fact that I brought a bill for the EU referendum that we held, the easiest way to do it would be to talk through what actually happened. And you can trace the debate on our membership of the EU, the UK's membership of the EU, back to the 1975 referendum, 1973 when we joined. It was reasonably controversial. 1975, a referendum was held, and again, reasonably controversial, but people voted 2-1 to remain, for the UK to remain a member of the European Union. following on from that period, coinciding with an extended period of Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher and then John Major, the debate on our membership of the EU slowly started to evolve and change. You had the Single European Act in the late 1980s, which was a very significant transfer of powers to the EU. We had the Maastricht Treaty in the 1990s under John Major, which was a vote in Parliament that with his narrow majority, he very nearly lost, that caused huge divisions in the Conservative Party, and which transferred further powers to the European Union. And those divisions and that tension within the Conservative Party led, in part, to the general election defeat in 1997, when Tony Blair's Labour Party enjoyed a landslide victory against John Major's Conservatives, which began the period of 13 years of Labour government, with a Labour Party that was united on Europe, which was almost without exception of the view that Europe was a good thing, the European Union was a good thing, of which the UK should be part, and a Conservative Party in which the divisions which had come to the surface over 18 years of Conservative government, which had grown in significance since that referendum in 1975, in which those divisions continued to grow, in which they continued to be debated, in which people's positions evolved and changed, but the party did not manage to unify over this big issue of its place, of the UK's place in the European Union and the UK's place in the world. Then along came somebody called David Cameron, who was the last Prime Minister before the one we have now, and who was elected as leader of the Conservative Party after the 2005 general election defeat. So Tony Blair won in 1997, he won again in 2001, and he won again, although by less because of factors like the Iraq War, in 2005. In 2005, the Conservatives fought on what is widely considered to be one of the most right-wing manifestos that the party had fought on to date. It had a very hard-hitting campaign. It improved its position somewhat, but was still quite far from being a realistic contender for government. And the person who wrote the manifesto on which the 2005 election was held, was fought by the Conservatives, was David Cameron, who was at the time the Shadow Secretary of State for Education, a new MP who had been elected in 2001. David Cameron was elected leader after the 2005 election, and he set about changing the image of the Conservative Party. He adopted climate change as a major issue. He went to ride with huskies in snow-covered mountains of Iceland or Alaska or wherever it was, I don't remember. He worked very hard to leave behind both the divisions on the issues like Europe, but also the quite hard-edged conservative with a small c reputation that the party had, and to move it towards what was then perceived to be the electorally successful centre ground, the centre ground that had been so effectively occupied by Tony Blair, still at that stage, for so long. Tony Blair's time came to an end, partly through internal pressure in the Labour Party, partly because he'd been Prime Minister for somewhere in the region of 10 years, and he was replaced by his Chancellor, his number two, effectively without election, Gordon Brown, who was rather less charismatic than Tony and who was rather less of an electoral asset than Tony Blair in his heyday had been. And this coincided with David Cameron's moving of the Conservative Party onto the traditionally more electorally successful centre ground. It coincided with his efforts to seize that space in politics where in most Western liberal democracies, most elections are won. There are, of course, exceptions. We perhaps are living through one of those exceptions now, but nonetheless, it is traditionally the case that you win elections by tacking towards the centre, and he put huge energy and investment into doing that. Now, the context of the British political system, for those who may not be aware, we have a constituency-based first-past-the-post system where each individual parliamentary constituency elects one MP and sends them to Parliament, and the party with the most MPs, the party with a majority of the MPs, forms a government. The leader of that party becomes the Prime Minister. Nearly all elections under that system produce majority governments. They produce strong governments, with very occasional exceptions, one of which was the 2010 election, when David Cameron won a significant victory in terms of the number of seats he was able to take from the Labour Party, but not sufficient to actually put the Conservatives in government on their own. And that meant that he had to form an alliance, a coalition, with the third party, as was then in British politics, the Liberal Democrats. They had 57 seats at the time, and together with the Conservatives, that gave a comfortable working majority. And so we had the end of Labour government after 13 years. We had a new Conservative government with somebody who hadn't even been in Parliament when Conservatives were last in power, and a cabinet made up in the whole of people who did not have governing experience. But most significantly, perhaps, we also had a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, this other generally perceived to be slightly left of centre but moderate party, forming coalition with the Conservatives, and as part of that deal, taking a number of the cabinet positions, including Deputy Prime Minister, Secretary of State for Energy, Secretary of State for Business, and some of the key positions in government. And this worked reasonably well, but it presented a number of challenges for the Conservative Party internally. We didn't have enough for a majority on our own, but we still had divisions internally over issues like the UK's membership of the European Union. With a majority that was actually quite healthy in Parliament, of about 60, with all of these Liberal Democrats who we suddenly found were voting with us, there was greater space for individual Conservative MPs to rebel against their party, to pick issues on which they might not agree with the leadership of the Conservative Party, to demonstrate their frustration. And when people start to do this, when people start to get into the habit of doing this, slowly over time their numbers grow, and slowly over time it becomes more and more difficult to manage those issues over which there are divisions. And this is what started to happen. It was a combination of people who'd perhaps expected a job and didn't get one, partly and perhaps entirely in their minds because of coalition. So one of the things in our system is that our executive is made up of our legislature. Our executive are members of Parliament or members of the House of Lords. And so members of Parliament aspire on the whole to have government jobs. And if you go into coalition, a big share of the government jobs that should have been available to you in your party when your party won an election are taken away. And if you're one of those people who expected a job and doesn't get one, you may be rather unhappy about that circumstance. The people who believe passionately about Europe, for many people in British politics, this is why they went into politics. This is a big existential issue about which they cared very much. For them, they wanted to see a Conservative government or even a coalition government do more to stand up to what they perceived to be European Union interference in matters which should be the responsibility of the UK government alone. And those, of course, who just would become disgruntled, or individual issuers would feel passionately on matters of principle and would find themselves rebelling. Nonetheless, the story became, over about 2 years, of a Conservative Party that was increasingly willing to stand up to its own leadership in Parliament, increasingly willing to vote against its own whip, and the government even started to lose occasionally votes on issues to do with Europe, which became quite embarrassing and caused internal tensions within the party, with our party members as well, often seeing this as an issue of concern. Outside of that, there was a new party called UKIP, which has been around for a little while, but started to gain traction, the United Kingdom Independence Party, fighting solely on the issue of leaving the European Union and things associated with that. And they were perceived to be putting pressure on the Conservative vote and putting at risk Conservative seats, which of course then added to the pressure for individual Conservative MPs to show a Eurosceptic position so that they could try to bring back the electors that they worried were going off to UKIP back in their constituencies. All of this came together to add to the pressure to David Cameron to decide what he could do about the issue of Europe. And in early 2013, he gave a speech at Bloomberg, which many say was the speech that was the beginning of the end of David Cameron, where he set out for the first time in clear terms that it would be Conservative Party policy to have a referendum on our membership of the European Union. The problem he had then was that people didn't quite understand how he could be Prime Minister and say we would have a referendum, but we weren't having one. Because the coalition partners, the Liberal Democrats, would never agree to government time in Parliament being given to legislation for a referendum. They didn't see it as part of the coalition deal, and without their support, the Conservatives didn't have a majority to deliver it. So David Cameron could talk about the aspiration to have a referendum. He could make the commitment that his party would do it, but he was actually unable to deliver it in Parliament at the same time as being Prime Minister and being the leader of the democratic institution of the country. And for most ordinary voters, that presented serious questions. That presented the issues around trust and believability. That presented the need to explain when someone said, well, you've promised it, why haven't you done it? Some of the intricate details of parliamentary democracy and the challenges that that brings with it. I think it was Reagan that said, if you're explaining, you're losing. Well, David Cameron quite quickly found that to be the case. He found, despite his statement, despite his promise, despite feeling he'd moved very significantly on this issue for the first time to promise a referendum, because he was unable to deliver it, people also doubted and questioned his commitment to it. And that's where my involvement came in. As part of the demonstration of that commitment, the solidifying of that commitment as Conservative policy and the process of legislating for that commitment in Parliament. So in the UK system, we have 650 MPs. And I apologise if people know how this works, but I will explain it anyway, because lawyers may be interested in it, and it is the context in which my involvement in this particular aspect of the story came about. Government brings bills to Parliament. The opposition have a certain number of days every year when they can control the business of Parliament, but of course they tend to lose votes. So they do things which are mainly for gesture, mainly for statement, which very rarely lead to legislative change. The government has to allocate, given the time that it has, in terms of priority, the bills that it will bring forward, the time it will give to ensure the transition through the legislative process. There are 13 days in every parliamentary session. The parliamentary session is around a year, which are given for backbench business. They're on Fridays when Parliament doesn't normally sit, and Parliament will sit especially on a Friday to allow individual MPs who are not members of the government to bring legislation of their choosing. These are often used for either controversial statement making or non-controversial legislation passing. Because if it's a controversial bill, perhaps you can't get government or opposition to table time for it, and therefore you could use a backbench day, a Friday, a sitting Friday, to bring it to Parliament and have it debated, but it's got very little chance of success. If it's not controversial, and you're able to bring it, then perhaps nobody will oppose it, and you've got a better chance of it being successful and actually turning it into law. What you very rarely get with private members' bills are controversial private members' bills that become law. The reason for that is there are only 13 days, sitting Fridays, allocated for private members' business. The way that that works is that the first 7 of those days are allocated for second reading debates, the key stage to see if your bill can go forward. And if somebody talks for sufficient length, chances are you won't get through your legislation that day. The filibustering will be successful. The next Friday will already be allocated to somebody else's bill, and you'll be lucky to find a day when you can bring yours and get it through before you've run out of time. So if it's controversial, if even one member of Parliament sets their mind to blocking what you're doing, they can block it. With the exception that if you have a closure motion, which is if you have to have more than 100 MPs vote in order for it to be valid, you can get to a stage in the debate that day where the House can say, Parliament can say, this has been sufficiently debated that we are going to consider this stage of the debate closed and have a vote on moving it forward. The reason most MPs on private members' bills cannot move closure motions to defeat filibustering is that private members' bills are on Fridays, and MPs go back to their constituencies on Fridays. And so even if you have a controversial but popular bill, the chances that it is so popular you can get 100 of your colleagues to turn up on a Friday and walk through the lobby to vote for your bill are pretty slender. And even then, you've got to do the whole thing again in the House of Lords when it gets to the next stage of the legislative process. And so private members' bills, to be successful, are dull. And if they're interesting, they are almost invariably not successful, other than in quite extreme circumstances. But for David Cameron, he had no way of bringing a bill for a referendum on our membership of the European Union to Parliament in government time. He couldn't get his coalition partners to agree to it. If he tabled it unilaterally within the coalition, that would potentially break the coalition and cause an election. And remember, the context of 2013 was that the Conservative Party was relatively unpopular in the country and under pressure from this new party, UKIP, that I've already talked about. And the last thing that David Cameron would have wanted, and indeed many of his MPs would have been a snap general election at that time, called because he couldn't get his legislation through Parliament, focused on the issue of our membership of the European Union. That's generally not a good space in which to fight a general election mid-term. And so he looked around for a mechanism by which he could bring the legislation and have a vote in Parliament through which he could demonstrate his support. And he settled on the private members' bills, the private members' ballot process, which is where I came to play a part in the story. So the private members' bills are effectively legislation by lottery. To get to bring the bill, and I've explained a little bit about how they work, we have what is all but a large tombola drum. MPs go into a lobby and put their name by a number, and 20 names are drawn out of this drum once a year by the Deputy Speaker, and those 20 individuals get the chance to bring their bills. And the first 7 names, or the top 7 names, I should say, are the ones that have the most chance of their bills being successful, because they will take each in turn of the first 7 days that are allocated to second reading debates. So entirely by chance, you might get the opportunity to bring a piece of private members' legislation. Entirely by chance, for the first year, probably in living memory, there was an expectation and a level of media interest in what was happening in this space, brought about by David Cameron's speech at Bloomberg and by the narrative around the UK's membership of the European Union. And entirely by chance, I didn't turn up to the drawing of the ballot. I wasn't even in the building at the time. And the Deputy Speaker, because so much of the national media did turn up, decided for the first time in the history of private members' bills and the private members' ballot to draw it in reverse order. So previously, if whatever number came out first was the person who was first through to the 20th. This time, the person who was drawn out first was 20th, and he counted down to the first. And so I perhaps, it won't be a surprise, came top of this ballot, which is years of fundraising raffles and practice that I've had at Conservative Party events coming through to finally pay off. But I wasn't there, and I had no expectation of it, and it's a chance of something like 1 in 400 odd, depending how many people put in for the private members' ballot. So with no expectation, my phone went that morning, and it was a chap called Mark Darcy who works at the BBC Radio 4 and does the Westminster Hour. He does a sort of commentary programme on politics. And he said, "Is that James Wharton?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh, congratulations, Mr. Wharton." And I said, "Well, what for?" So you've just come top of the private members' ballot. I said, "Oh, thank you for telling me." My phone then began to ring off the hook as journalists scrabbled around to find out what my number was and Googled this person that many of them had never heard of. But the next call I actually took was from the Deputy Chief Whip, Sir John Randall. I said, "James?" "Yes, John. Hi, John. Come to the Whip's office now." So, "Oh, okay." So I set off to find the Whip's office, the government Whip's office, knowing full well that the expectation was whichever Conservative was most highly ranked in this ballot would bring forward the legislation promised by David Cameron, legislation for us to have a referendum on our membership of the European Union. And I set off through Parliament, and it was one of the most wonderful experiences I've had, because by this time I was on the ticker tape on Sky News. I was being all of the national news was speculating, this James Wharton person, is he going to do the EU Referendum Bill? There was a slow news day, I don't know, but this was, my mum texted me to ask if I was okay, because my name was on the news, but she didn't know why. And as I went past people in Parliament, all my colleagues and friends were saying things to me like, "Oh, well done, congratulations, this is really good." And I've never, for having done nothing but put my name in a ballot, been so widely congratulated by people that I've come across in my life. And as I went through, I met one MP who's a very good friend of mine, Simon Hart, who's an MP in Wales, but used to be the chief executive of the Countryside Alliance, which is a sort of country sports campaign organisation in the UK, which campaigned extensively on the issue of fox hunting, which I'm sure is great interest to people here in Harvard. But fox hunting was banned under Tony Blair's government, and there's been a long-running, low-level campaign, occasionally raising up the political agenda about whether that ban should be repealed or not. And it's a real issue for people who care passionately about fox hunting. For a lot of other people, it's not a bread-and-butter issue about which they are enthusiastically and passionately concerned. But I saw Simon, and Simon sort of had a chat with me and said, "Well done." And I got to the government whip's office finally and knocked on the door. And I opened the door, and the entire government whip's office, who are the members of Parliament that make up our whips, and the chief whip, cheered when I opened the door. And I said, no, I'm doing fox hunting. And they didn't laugh. The chief whip sat me down, and he gave me a piece of paper. He said, "There's your bill." And they dispatched me off to deal with the flood of media interviews that I was getting, with all of the other things that had to go with it. I was rather bewildered, still quite new and young MP, who now found myself at the centre of national media attention, but doing something which was very important, not just for my party, but in terms of whatever direction my country would choose to take in the future. And I can't remember how many TV interviews. I did all the BBC channels, BBC Parliament, BBC One, radio channels, Al Jazeera, probably some American channels. I was just doing one interview after another to all of these. Russia Today, who seem to take an inordinate interest in British politics from an unusual angle, and doing all these various things. I still remember I was doing Radio 4 World at One, which is one of our big programs, quite a high-level, sort of highbrow programming, having all these discussions. I had a queue of other media applications. I felt at the center of political debate, and then in the early afternoon, and I remember exactly where I was, David Beckham announced he was retiring. And after that, I did Northeast Regional Radio. And the media narrative just swept over to this mega story that was David Beckham's retirement. And I was left clutching my bill, having done my interviews, now as the number 2 item on all the news. But that's how the sort of process began. So, of course, I was top of the ballot, which meant I got first choice. I chose the first day. The bill, which was to do this momentous thing, was drafted to be 3 clauses long. If I recall correctly, and I've got a copy of it somewhere, it was that we will have a referendum, who will be able to vote in the referendum, and the conduct of the referendum will be decided by the Electoral Commission. There are then 2 other technical clauses, and that was it. It was drawn to be as tight as it possibly could, and I'll explain in a moment why that was the case. I chose the first possible day to bring it to Parliament for its second reading debate. And, of course, as I said earlier, the challenge then was to get enough Conservative MPs to Parliament to ensure that we could move the closure motion, which would ensure that it didn't run out of time that day when people who were opposed to it tried to filibuster it. Because I had the support of my party machine, that was relatively easy, but just in case, and just to help, David Cameron opened up the garden of number 10 Downing Street the night before and did a barbecue for all Conservative MPs, where he personally served the burgers and the sausages at the barbecue. They arranged the Conservative MPs' team photo in Parliament for that entire Parliament. We don't do this very often. That the night before, and we all went and sat and had our photo taken. And they put a very strict 3-line whip on, which was that, you know, if you're not there, you're probably not going to be a Conservative MP in the following morning. You have to be there. They put an incredibly strict whip on it. Because it wasn't just about winning, it was about demonstrating the Conservative Party really was serious about having this referendum. I always remember the former Chief Whip, Sir Patrick McLaughlin, or just Patrick McLaughlin at the time, at the barbecue where I was the only sober person. And I was sort of nervously thinking about the speech that I had to give the next day. Patrick's a big, sort of blunt chap. Came up, whacked me on the back to give me some friendly advice. He said, "James," I said, "Yes, Patrick." He said, "Tomorrow," I said, "Yeah, don't fuck it up." I said, "Thank you." Wandered off. But nonetheless, I had that level of enthusiastic, passionate support from my colleagues. I got through the second reading, thanks to the attendance of this large number of Conservative MPs. It was half-heartedly opposed by the Labour Party, because this was the first time it started to become a real thing that a referendum might happen. And you could see that it started to create division and tension in the Labour Party and the opposition as well. The newspapers started to report that the Labour Party cabinet, shadow cabinet, was split almost 50-50 on whether they should support or oppose the bill. It created relative unity in the Conservative Party because people got behind what we were doing, and even those who wanted to stay in the European Union accepted the argument that there should be a referendum on it. And the argument that I put forward was very carefully framed to be an argument for why we should have a referendum, rather than what the outcome of that referendum should be. And it went through its second reading, it went through its committee stage, it got through its third reading in due course, it got through all of the relevant stages that it needed to in the House of Commons. At every single stage, the media commentary was that surely this is not going to get anywhere, it's not realistic, is it? It's not going to happen, it won't get through this stage or this stage, and every time it did, until it went off to the House of Lords, where it was ultimately killed. One of the stages that presented the greatest risk to it in the Commons, and the one that ultimately killed it in the Lords, and this is where the legal drafting of the bill becomes relevant, is the committee stage at which people propose amendments. The more tightly you can draw the bill, of course, the less scope there is to amend it, which was the purpose of having a 3-clause bill. But nonetheless, dozens and dozens of valid amendments were found. For every amendment, the person moving it gets the opportunity to speak to it, and that means that you start to run out of time. And if you start to run out of time, when time is limited, ultimately your bill will fail. Well, we had defeated that in the Commons. We, despite all of the amendments that were made, managed to, with the sort of support of, but right support of the Speaker, the amendments were grouped into sections and debates, and we were able to get through those debates in the time that was available effectively and successfully, so that the bill got through the Commons. That did not prove possible in the Lords, where ultimately the bill died, particularly, in no small part, because the Conservatives don't have a majority in the House of Lords, and so couldn't move closure motions and couldn't stop amendments, and ultimately couldn't control what the House of Lords did. And so the bill as was, those three clauses, never actually made it all the way through both houses into law. But the story of David Cameron's commitment at his Bloomberg speech, of the bill that I brought forward that was then supported by Conservative MPs, and the very clear commitment and statement that David Cameron made, went on to colour what happened in the general election that followed 2 years later in 2015. In 2015, the issue of Europe had actually gone down the agenda somewhat. It was still relevant and it was still important. It was part of the election debate. But as always, elections are fought on a broad range of issues, many of which are the day-to-day issues that directly affect the people who are voting. And issues like Europe tend to be of great interest to a fewer number of people. They tend to be a niche pursuit that people passionately hold, rather than one that grips the whole nation. And so the election was fought, yes, partly on Europe, but on all sorts of other issues as well. And perhaps to his surprise, this is something on which I cannot really speak with great authority, the Conservatives, against the odds and against the opinion polls, won a majority in that election. And that majority put us in government in our own right. Our coalition partners, to be frank, at whose expense we won the majority, went down to 8 seats and were almost wiped out, with some huge swings displacing our junior coalition partners' MPs. And that meant that David Cameron was not only in government with a Conservative majority, but that he had no reason and no space in which he could now not offer the referendum that he'd promised and that he'd demonstrated his commitment to so firmly in the votes we'd had previously. And indeed, his own party would not have allowed, MPs in his own party would not have allowed him not to offer it. So he then passed another rather longer and more detailed bill about our plans for a referendum, delivered that referendum, which took place last year, to the surprise of many observers and commentators, and potentially to the surprise of David Cameron himself. That referendum voted for the UK to leave the European Union, the largest popular vote for anything in British history, with 52 to 48 voting that we should withdraw from membership of the EU. That has presented us now with what I think is a great opportunity in terms of reshaping our place in the world, but also with a number of quite significant challenges in how we now navigate through the process of negotiating our exit and legislating to deal with the reality that so much of our law for so long has come directly from the European Union, and untangling ourselves from institutions which have become so ingrained in the day-to-day life and running of the UK. That is still ongoing. The current debate in our Parliament is about giving the Prime Minister, now Theresa May, because of course when he lost the referendum, David Cameron announced that he would resign, and duly resigned rather more quickly than he'd anticipated, giving Theresa May the power to invoke Article 50. So Article 50 of the European treaties is the mechanism by which you leave. It's never been done. It is arguably quite vaguely drafted. There isn't a comprehensive plan for how a country leaves the EU. And the first question was whether the Prime Minister can use prerogative powers, those powers that in the UK system come directly from the monarch and are exercised by the Prime Minister on behalf of the monarch, could use prerogative powers to invoke Article 50 and begin the 2-year time capped, it can happen more quickly, negotiation process by which a country leaves the European Union. There was a court challenge that found that the Prime Minister couldn't. A sort of loose summary of the reason being that whilst the Prime Minister has always, through prerogative powers, been able to enter into and leave treaties, the European treaties created and were enshrined in UK domestic law by Parliament, and they created rights that British citizens had, which had been brought into law by Parliament and acts of Parliament. And so prerogative powers could not be used to unilaterally reverse that. Parliament would have to give permission and power to the Prime Minister to exercise that prerogative to be able to invoke Article 50. That's what we're currently debating. The bill for giving those powers to Theresa May went through the House of Commons only a few weeks ago. It's now in the House of Lords. Again, it's short, it's narrowly drafted. It simply gives the Prime Minister the power to effectively press the button on our leaving of the European Union. There is some debate, although I think it is relatively clear, on whether, once you have invoked Article 50, it can be reversed. I think the answer to that is no, but lawyers can read into it if they like and read the rather poorly drafted wording of the actual article and think about the implications of that, because the implications are you either reach a deal in 2 years or you leave without a deal. And no one really knows what leaving without a deal looks like. You would assume it would go to World Trade Organization rules in terms of trade. You would assume, and indeed there's some legal advice has been published recently, that indicates that the UK's financial obligations to the EU would cease. So things that had been entered into whilst we were a member but were future costs, we would not be liable for. The European Union would assume the opposite in respect of financial obligations and is making the case for a big financial contribution when the UK leaves. What is clear is there is now going to be a process of negotiation. And if a deal is reached, then we'll have that deal on which we will found our future relationship. And if a deal is not, then we will do it without a deal. And some of those issues will have to be worked out between the EU and the UK. But just before that can happen, the House of Lords needs to pass the bill so it can come back to the Commons, so it can turn into an act, so that we can give the power to the Prime Minister to do it. And if you believe what's talked of in the newspapers, I'll be careful what I say so as to be no more certain than that, then she wants to do it by the end of this month, which will kickstart that 2-year process, which will bring it to an end about a year before the likely date of the next general election, which will mean this issue is effectively dealt with and we know what the relationship is before we go into another general election in the UK to determine who the future government is going to be. The House of Lords is already amending the bill that we've sent them. The government has stated clearly in the newspapers and so on that those amendments will be overturned by the House of Commons. We don't know how much the House of Lords will put up resistance to that or will accept and acquiesce to the will of the House of Commons. And of course, the challenge for the government with a small majority is to hold together sufficiently strongly the Conservative and associated supporters vote that are backing what the government is now doing to ensure that we can not only overturn those but can pass into law the bill to actually begin the process of enacting our leaving of the European Union, of implementing the will of the British people as expressed in that referendum. So we live in interesting times in the UK. We thought this would perhaps be one of the most dramatic global political decisions that would be taken. We like to think quite highly of our relevance on global politics in the last year, only to be at the very last minute defeated by you here in the US, who played, as I think some of the pundits called it, your trump card, which has further raised questions and debate about where global politics is going. But there are both similarities and differences in the way our Brexit referendum unfolded, in what happened in your presidential election. There are similarities and differences in the new shape that the world is taking and the roles that our countries may respectively play in that new global world, in that new global order, however it might ultimately look. But I try to be optimistic, and I think that there are big opportunities in some of what is happening to reshape the way that we look at those around us and we look at the way that the international system has functioned for a long time. Because it is undeniably the case that for people like me and you, students at Harvard Law, the world has been quite a comfortable place. For an awful lot of people, there are things that they're frustrated with, there are things that they do not agree with, there are things that they feel disempowered and disenfranchised by. And to some extent, and in some part, that contributes to what we're seeing in politics now, not just here and in the UK, but actually across much of the Western world. And there is a real danger in the goldfish bowl bubble world of social media and tailored news that we ignore that and retreat into our own world and our own understanding of it, and that we talk to people who are like us and think like us, and people who agree with our opinions. I think that has contributed to where we have already found ourselves. And I think the big danger would have been that had we continued down that path, division would become greater and understanding would become less. I think actually some of the big decisions of the last year, whatever you think of those individual decisions, present us with a wake-up call and an opportunity to address that challenge, to change the path down which we were set, and to hopefully build closer and more unified societies and happier and more successful people as a result. I certainly view Brexit as an opportunity to do that for the UK. It's not for me to comment on what views you may hold of some of the interesting debates that are currently unfolding in US politics, but I hope that there would be agreement by most observers that if nothing else, we're certainly living in very interesting times indeed. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to come and speak. I'd be delighted, if appropriate, I assume it is, to take any questions. But thank you very much for coming to listen to what I had to say, and of course for coming to have some burritos and enjoy the evening as well. Thank you.
Anyone has questions? Yeah, got the. Sorry.
Thank you very much. I'm a Brit. I was there for the referendum and I voted in it. And one thing that was very noticeable during that time was that the sort of Labour response, and you mentioned it, was a bit shambolic. It was like there was no clear Labour position. And I was wondering, I've been out of the country since, whether you think Labour really has articulated a clear position on it and what their sort of take on it is right now, especially in light of the Supreme Court decision.
Thank you. You reminded me of something that I think I intended to say and didn't get around to. I commented that there was a time when the Conservative Party was very much split on Europe and Labour was very much united. And interesting, that has been almost entirely reversed. The Conservative Party now, although it still contains a number of views about what should have happened in that referendum, is pretty much united on respecting the result of that referendum and implementing it and getting the best possible deal we can. The Labour Party is entirely torn on the issue of whether they should oppose it and try to stop it from happening, or whether they should recognise and support it and what it should look like. So the Labour Party now, you're right, their contribution, such as it was to the referendum campaign, could be described as shambolic. I would say that things are probably, from the perspective of the Labour Party, or someone who were to care about the Labour Party if they were to be so wrong, their position has even further deteriorated. It's got even worse, and all the signs are it will continue to get worse for as long as they have their current leader, who is a chap called Jeremy Corbyn, his election's an entirely different story. If anybody wants to see, read about a real melodrama in politics, I would suggest you go and look at what happened there, how not to run a leadership election. Or maybe, maybe I shouldn't say that here. So I think that their position is worse, is deteriorating. They are now divided on Europe and we are not. And if they don't resolve some of those issues, or something else dramatic doesn't change, I think they're in real long-term trouble. There's an existential threat to the British Labour Party. Sorry.
So I'm Sarah, I'm also British and voted.
I've got the British audience here.
My question is about the uncertainty that followed the referendum. So obviously you talked about the Brexit case that went through the High Court and then the Supreme Court. It's caused an awful lot of uncertainty. Do you think that Parliament has to take some of the blame for that, for failing to consider what was going to happen if the referendum went the way that nobody thought it was going to go? There was absolutely no reason why in the bill that, and the act that finally allowed for the referendum, they couldn't have made arrangements for what was going to happen afterwards. But they didn't even think they didn't think through what was going to happen, and that's caused a lot of the uncertainty we've seen over the last 9 months. Okay, I mean that's interesting. You make an interesting observation, and you pose what I think is a very good question. I'm going to ask you to be a little bit forgiving of my answer because I'm being recorded and I'm still a member of the government until I get home. So I may caveat slightly what I say. It does appear to be the case that when David Cameron was Prime Minister and George Osborne was Chancellor, that they made a proactive and positive decision not to plan for a leave vote. It was rumoured in the papers, and I don't know whether it was true, that civil servants were prevented from planning. In 1975, when we had a referendum, the civil service drew up contingency plans for every option, and they had it ready to go whichever way the referendum had gone. That was not done this time. In fact, it was actively stopped from happening. Similarly, the debate in Parliament, you're quite right,
For example, the bill that we ultimately passed for a referendum didn't make the referendum binding and automatic. It effectively was an advisory referendum. Now, the political reality is it is a binding referendum. You can't ignore a referendum that has the largest popular vote there ever has been on something. But in legal terms, it was a non-binding, an advisory referendum, which didn't have any automatic effect. That's led to some of the issues over the actual invoking of Article 50, for example, that we have now. I think, though, that you could only have ever have gone so far to try to plan and draw out now what would have to follow. Because we know that Article 50 will have to be invoked if the referendum is to be respected, and that we'll have to do a process of negotiation for leaving the European Union. We don't know what that is going to ultimately result in. I can tell you that I'm confident that there will be a deal to be done. I can tell you that I think we've got the right team and that we've got a strong hand to play and that there are lots of things in our favour. But I can't tell you what the outcome is. I can tell you it has to be done within 2 years, but I don't know exactly what it will look like, and nor does anyone else. The only thing that I would say to the argument of uncertainty in general terms is that it's a very dangerous argument for people who believe in democracy to bandy about. Elections cause a huge amount of uncertainty, you may have noticed. Changing policy in any way can cause uncertainty, and the status quo is laden with uncertainty. The European Union has huge challenges coming down the track, from its unresolved banking crises to the Eurozone problems to the immigration problems that it is wrestling with. The political problems within the EU, I would argue, are at least as great in terms of the medium to long-term uncertainty they will cause as our decision to leave the EU. So is there uncertainty? There is uncertainty always in politics. Could the legislation have better provided for it? It could have differently provided for it, and there are things that could have been done that a decision was taken not to do. But ultimately, would that change the end result of where I think we were going? I suspect not significantly. And so I think we can dwell on it and debate it, but I don't really think it would significantly have changed where we'll end up.
Matteo, I'm not from the UK.
Hey.
I'm a resident of the UK. I live there. So there is some link. And my question is linked with her question. Your account of the facts was really fascinating. But you confirm my view of the fact that the referendum was basically a political choice. I mean, you had constantly referred to the need to show that Cameron was consistent with his. He needed to keep his word about the referendum. But I think that this political use, was really not associated and far from the real problem that this referendum would have opened. The uncertainty for myself as a resident in UK, or the problem of the UK in terms of free trade with the EU. I mean, it's not your opinion that your party stressed the political aspect of the referendum, disregarding the practical aspect of the referendum? I mean, just to give you an example, the referendum was used to topple down Cameron by Boris Johnson. That Boris Johnson was stabbed by Gove. Gove was stabbed by Theresa May. That take back Boris Johnson and put it for an office. So I'd like to know your view.
Yeah, well, okay. Was the referendum a political choice? Yes, of course it was. Doesn't mean it was wrong. In fact, I think it was right. And I think that if you follow the debate in British politics, what we'd seen over a period of time was a larger part of the public becoming concerned about the EU as an issue. Now, you can argue about whether they should have been. You can argue about whether they were being fed the truth or alternative facts or whatever it might be that our media was talking to people about. You can argue about the reasons. But as a political person, I can say with some certainty that Europe was slowly going up the agenda, that a larger minority of people were caring about it as time went on, and that this was starting to affect our politics in other ways. I talked a bit about the UK Independence Party as an example. I know from my post bag that I was getting more correspondence about it from people who were more angry about it. I know actually there are a lot of people who do care passionately about it and felt for other reasons that we needed to deal with it. So I think that the referendum actually was inevitable. It was just a question of when we did it. And the greater that political pressure had become, the longer had waited, then the less freedom we would have had over controlling what happened in terms of the timing and the delivery of that referendum, something which now perhaps David Cameron nonetheless regrets. He perhaps wished he'd had it a few years earlier. And the result would have been even less predictable than it ultimately turned out to be, because the atmosphere would have been even more highly charged the more that time went on and this issue was unresolved. So it was a political choice, and it does have practical consequences. I believed at the time, and still believe now, that in the medium to long term, those practical consequences can potentially be good for the UK. And I think some of the big challenges that Europe faces that I touched upon in answering the previous question add at least as much in terms of practical uncertainty to the lives of Europe's citizens as the referendum does. I believe as well that it is likely that a deal will be reached in respect of the rights of European citizens residing in the UK. I don't think you need to unduly worry about that. But again, I think it's important that the rights of British citizens living in the EU would be similarly respected, and that this is part of the negotiation process that will now be undertaken. But I can't deny that it's a political choice. Everything that politicians do is. I feel it was the right political choice. I feel that we got the right result, but that regardless of the result, this is something that needed to happen sooner or later. If we hadn't done it now, it would have happened later, and the longer we'd have left it, the more highly charged the environment in which it took place was likely to be. But what's actually fascinating, I suppose, just, is the extent to which the UK is calm about it. There aren't huge numbers of upset people. There aren't huge ongoing debates. Most people that I encounter in my constituency or in politics have accepted the result and want to get on with it now that it's done. They may not be happy about what happened. There are lots of people who voted one way and feel that it shouldn't have come out how it did. 48% of the population voted to remain. But actually the country is stable and relatively united as much as it ever is on big political issues and secure, and we haven't seen some of the turbulence that can follow these big sort of potentially polarising decisions. And I think that's welcome. I think it speaks positively to the political environment in which debate is taking place in the UK. It gives us the best possible chance of making this a successful process. And I wouldn't be confident if we left it for very much longer, if we'd left it to the point at which a government of whatever colour was forced to hold a referendum. I wouldn't be as confident that that would have been the outcome in terms of political stability.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. A lot of pressure.
Yeah. Actually, a set of questions about procedure, the procedural parliamentary maneuvering that you were talking about so interestingly, and then I guess a more substantive question. So can you explain a little bit more specifically how closure works? It sounded like at one point you were saying anybody could sort of talk as long as they like, and you wouldn't be able to get your private bill to a second reading. But then you said, you described some maneuverings that made that possible. So that's one part of the procedure. And the other is your treatment by the whip and how the hierarchy of the party enforce discipline among its members. It's it's an issue here, of course, in this country. And there's interesting, the resemblance, even the language is quite similar and interesting to me. The substantive question is, I think I barely heard the word immigration in your talk. And it's my understanding that that was a key factor, the concerns that some people had about immigration from Eastern Europe in particular. I think I heard a figure around 300,000, maybe that's not the correct number. But
that's about right.
that concerns about that, maybe resentments, were part of what led to people to vote the way they did for exiting. What's your view about, what's your understanding about immigration as an issue?
Okay. Three quite different questions, see if I can remember what they all are by the time I get to the end of this. So closure motions, you're quite right. So if we take away the issue of a closure motion, you can talk in the British Parliament in normal circumstances for as long as you like, basically as long as you're not repeating yourself or doing something which is demonstrably unparliamentary. You're speaking to the motion, then you can go for as long as you want to speak to it, which means filibustering is quite practically possible to talk a bill out, particularly a private member's bill. The reality, though, is that most of the time, if it's a government bill, that won't work, because if you reach the allocated time anyway, there will be a vote and it will move on, so people don't do it. But for private members' bills, it's possible. You can stop somebody from doing that if you can persuade the Speaker that there has been long enough for debate, and if you can then call a vote on what's called a closure motion, and you have to have at least 100 MPs vote for the closure motion in order for it to be effective. So it is a tool that you can use. You can't arbitrarily do it after a couple of minutes. The Speaker has to be satisfied there's been enough of a debate. But when they feel that there has been, and particularly if somebody is trying to play the game of talking a bill out, then they will let you move a closure motion, and if you've got the numbers and you win the vote, then you move to force it to the vote on the second reading or whatever it might be. So that's how a closure motion works. It's effectively a mechanism to stop things being talked out, but it has quite a high threshold of support that has to be demonstrated. It's up to the Speaker that it can be called, but then there's a threshold of MPs that have to be there, and that's what normally causes the problems for private members' bills, because they're on Fridays, and we go back to our constituencies on Fridays. The whips, I suspect there are similarities. Look, whipping has changed throughout the years. I remember when I was first elected, my whip came to me. I assume people are broadly aware that whips are, certainly in the UK context, MPs who are given the job by the government of opposition of making sure that all of the other MPs vote with their party. And they can use positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And my whip said to me that he takes, my first whip, that he takes a carrot and stick approach to whipping, but he prefers to use the carrot, and it's amazing what you can do with a sharpened carrot. So, you know, do they use the sort of House of Cards style tactics to make people do what they want to do? Well, I've never been a whip, and I've never been subjected to those sort of tactics. I think that there is a legitimate role in a democracy for whipping and for party discipline. Because if we're going to have functioning government, you have to be able to get your legislation through. But ultimately, if a legislator feels so passionately about something that they won't support their party, they are able to not support their party. They have the freedom to vote against it. And there is only so much that the party can do to penalise them. And so it's quite a good mechanism that means that government functions and can deliver, but that ultimately, in extremis or in some great issue of principle, individual legislators do still have the freedom to vote against things that they don't like and against their party if they really, really want to and are prepared to make whatever other sacrifices may come along with that. And your final question on immigration, it was a part of the debate in the campaign. I'm always wary of when anybody says this is the reason that something happened, because any political campaign and any political event and decision is a coming together of all sorts of different reasons. Could I stand here and honestly say immigration was not an issue in the EU referendum campaign? No, I couldn't. But nor would I stand here and say that is the reason that it went the way it went. Certainly it was part of the debate. Certainly some people do feel a frustration about immigration. But even then, it falls into multiple categories of frustration. There are those who are frustrated in principle that the UK doesn't have control of its borders, rather than debating what should be done with that control. There are those, particularly in those communities with very large numbers of people having come in, who might be frustrated by the way that their community has changed and want to see that change. But there are any number of people who voted for any number of other reasons as well. So was it a factor? Yes. If it wasn't a factor, would the referendum have gone the way it had? I don't know, but there would probably have been other factors that moved into that space.
But I was asking you your view about immigration.
My view of immigration?
Yeah.
I support the government. And I believe it's important that we have control, which is what we'll get from leaving the European Union, or greater control than we have now. But then it's for the government of the day and for people to mandate it to determine what best to do with the control that they have. And I will be careful not to be too much further drawn on it, if that's okay, because it is a challenging issue. And the danger of the populist siren voices can do more harm than good in politics, but so can a misplaced word of moderation if it is misrepresented by those who seek to do you political harm. So I will leave it at, I think we should be in charge of our own borders and then decide what we want to do with them. And that is the issue, actually, predominantly, that the immigration issue was fought on in the EU campaign. You will not find many of the main serious commentators on the Vote Leave side who actually used immigration as it should be reduced. There are exceptions. You will find that most said, and are on the record of saying, it's about having control over it. What we do with that control is then a matter for the British government and for the people of the UK who choose that government.
Well put.
Thank you.
Thanks. Unfortunately, James has to catch a flight pretty quickly, so if we can all thank him so much for joining us.